It's hard to imagine a mighty empire rising from a soggy patch of lowland barely above sea level. But that's exactly what happened in the 1600s, when a new republic, just born out of rebellion, turned its eyes from flooded fields to distant horizons. The Dutch, newly freed from the crushing grip of Spanish rule, found themselves in possession of something far rarer than gold: determination, daring, and a deep thirst for trade. Picture it: windmills dotting the countryside, canals slicing through towns like watery streets, and sturdy wooden ships being hammered together in the shipyards of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The year is 1602, and this fledgling republic, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, isn't a traditional empire with kings and crowns. Instead, it's run by merchant families, city councils, and provincial assemblies. Power is shared, debated, and fiercely guarded. But in one thing, the Dutch agree: the future lies beyond the sea. Spain and Portugal have already divided much of the New World between them. The English are prowling the Atlantic. But the Dutch? They have something special: access to capital. Their wealthy citizens are ready to invest, and shipbuilding is one of the best in Europe. Dutch sailors are tough and clever, navigating treacherous waters with grit. And while they lack large armies or imperial might, they possess a cunning ability to trade, negotiate, and, when needed, fight with terrifying precision. At the heart of the Dutch miracle lies their geography. The Netherlands is a land won from the sea. Through dikes and pumps, the Dutch have kept the ocean at bay, turning marsh into farmland and building towns below sea level. That same engineering brilliance finds its way into their ships. Sleek and nimble, Dutch merchant vessels, like the Flight, require fewer crew, cost less to build, and carry more cargo than their rivals. More profit per voyage, more voyages per year. Still, for all their skills, the Dutch wouldn't have gotten far without a common cause. That cause? Independence and revenge. The 80 Years' War with Spain wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a battle for economic survival. Spanish forces had closed off traditional markets in the south. So, the Dutch were forced to look elsewhere, toward the rich spice islands of Southeast Asia, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the silver ports of Japan. If they couldn't trade in Europe, they'd trade with the world. The early voyages were risky. Ships were lost. Crews starved or perished from disease. But success came quickly, and with it ambition. Small merchant companies began banding together, realizing that coordinated power and deep pockets were needed to compete with the Portuguese monopoly on Asian trade. By 1602, a revolutionary idea took hold: form a united trading company, backed by the state, with the power to wage war, forge treaties, and colonize territories. Thus, the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or Dutch East India Company, VOC, was born, the world's first multinational corporation. But this wasn't just a company in the modern sense. The VOC was a hybrid of business and empire, profit and power. It had ships, soldiers, governors, and cannons. It answered not to kings, but to shareholders. And it would change the world. As the VOC launched its first expeditions, Amsterdam began to transform. Warehouses filled with pepper, nutmeg, and porcelain. Shipyards roared with the clang of hammers. Merchants whispered about fortunes made and lost in faraway ports. The scent of exotic goods mixed with the salt air of the harbor. This was more than trade. It was empire, born from enterprise. The Dutch, with their small population and limited land, could never rival the manpower of Spain or the vastness of the English colonies. But they didn't need to. They mastered the art of leverage, using money, ships, and contracts to bind the world into a web of commerce with themselves at the center. And it all began here, in the mud, the wind, and the cold determination of a republic that refused to stay small. The birth of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 marked a turning point, not just for the Netherlands, but for global trade itself. The VOC wasn't merely a collection of merchant investors. It was a state-sanctioned force, complete with its own navy, armed troops, colonial governors, and legal authority to sign treaties or declare war. Its goal? Break the Portuguese stranglehold on the spice trade and carve out a Dutch domain stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the ports of Japan. The company wasted no time. Its first fleets surged eastward, sailing around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. These weren't timid merchants knocking politely at the door. They arrived with loaded cannons and open ambitions. Fortresses were built. Alliances were struck, sometimes with gifts and promises, other times with threats and firepower. The VOC offered local rulers what the Portuguese never could: better prices, more consistent trade, and occasionally, protection from their enemies. And when diplomacy failed, the Dutch weren't afraid to unleash violence. One of their key targets was the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, an archipelago in today's Indonesia where cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew in abundance. These spices were worth their weight in gold back in Europe. The VOC moved quickly to secure these riches, ousting Portuguese garrisons, seizing forts, and blockading rival traders. In 1621, they annihilated the resistance of the native Bandanese population after a brutal campaign, removing or replacing much of the local population with enslaved labor and Dutch settlers. This was ruthless commerce, master's strategy. Control of the spice trade wasn't just about making money. It was about denying rivals. The VOC understood that supply could be manipulated, monopolized. By destroying nutmeg trees on islands they didn't control and stockpiling cloves in Amsterdam warehouses, they engineered scarcity. Prices soared. Profits multiplied. This was not the free market at work. It was early-stage corporate dominance backed by cannon fire. The company operated through a centralized headquarters in Amsterdam, but its real power lay in Batavia, present-day Jakarta. Built on the ashes of a Javanese port town, Batavia became the beating heart of Dutch operations in Asia. It was a fortress city, a bustling entrepot, a European outpost halfway across the world. From here, the VOC administered its territories, coordinated convoys, and deployed its navy to protect shipping lanes. Meanwhile, VOC ships became icons of power. Sleek, sturdy, and bristling with guns, they sailed in tightly choreographed fleets. Each vessel carried letters of instruction, maps, secret orders, and crates of silver, Europe's only real currency in Asian markets. Gold wasn't welcome. Spices and silks weren't bartered. It was silver the VOC poured into the East, collected through trade, tax, or piracy. Yet, while the VOC was a commercial enterprise, it also built a state within a state. Dutch governors ruled foreign territories with sweeping authority. They managed native populations, settled disputes, and sometimes imposed Dutch law and culture. Missionary work, though not as zealous as the Spanish, followed in the company's wake. Protestant chapels rose beside spice warehouses. Dutch schools taught the children of mixed marriages. And yet, in many places, the VOC was content to rule indirectly, propping up friendly sultans or princes so long as they guaranteed access to trade. The company's actions blurred the line between corporation and colonialism. It didn't just move goods, it moved people. Enslaved labor from Africa and Southeast Asia worked plantations and ports. Prisoners were shipped off to distant colonies. Entire communities were uprooted to satisfy the VOC's logistical needs. All this was justified in ledgers and balance sheets. So long as profits flowed, few back in Amsterdam asked too many questions. Back home, VOC shares were traded on the world's first stock exchange. Investors, some rich, some ordinary burghers, watched the news from the east like hawks. Every lost ship, every captured fort, every alliance signed could affect dividends. The company's directors, called the Gentlemen 17, ruled with both ambition and caution. They played a long game, maintaining trade routes, spreading risk, and ensuring the company stayed profitable, even if that meant military interventions in Persia, bribes in India, or embargoes in Japan. And the results were staggering. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company was the richest and most powerful trading company on earth. It had over 100 ships at sea, tens of thousands of employees, and a presence on every major Asian coastline. It minted its own coins. It maintained private armies. And its governors wielded more influence than some kings. But behind this dazzling facade was a deeper truth. The VOC's empire was built on precision and pressure, opportunity and oppression. It was a corporate machine, lubricated by silver and blood, fueled by ambition and governed by spreadsheets before spreadsheets even existed. With Batavia as its central command post, the Dutch East India Company extended its web across the seas, spinning an empire not of land and borders, but of routes and ports, contracts and cargo. Unlike the Spanish, who planted flags and converted souls, or the English, who sent settlers to tame wild frontiers, the Dutch built their empire afloat, on the backs of flights, warehouses, and trade agreements. To hold it all together, they needed more than firepower. They needed efficiency, diplomacy, and above all, control. Every link in their maritime chain had to work smoothly, from the shipyards in Zeeland to the pepper fields of Sumatra. And they were masters at this logistics game. One of their earliest and most strategic moves was seizing the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. A rugged, windswept point on the southern tip of Africa, it offered no spices, no gold, no large native empires to exploit. But what it did have was location. The VOC saw it as the perfect halfway house, a refueling station for fresh meat, water, and repairs on the grueling journey between Europe and Asia. Soon, the Dutch had established a permanent colony there, laying the foundations for what would eventually become South Africa. From there, they reached east to Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, ousting the Portuguese and dominating the cinnamon trade. They built forts and negotiated with local rulers, offering protection or, if necessary, coercion. Further north, in India, the Dutch gained footholds in cities like Surat and Pulakit, although competition with the British East India Company was fierce. Still, the Dutch were less interested in conquest and more in access. Secure a port, secure a trade. And they didn't stop there. The VOC extended its reach to Persia for silk, to Siam, Thailand, for rice and timber, and to China for porcelain and tea. They played the role of humble guests in the courts of mighty Asian empires, never demanding, always offering, always watching. In Japan, they pulled off one of their most impressive feats. In 1641, the Dutch became the only Westerners allowed to trade under the Tokugawa shogunate's strict isolationist policy. The trick? Submission and subtlety. While the Spanish and Portuguese pushed Catholicism, the Dutch downplayed religion entirely. They agreed to stay confined to a man-made island called Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. No churches. No wandering. No mixing with locals. Just business. And it worked. For over 2 centuries, the Dutch maintained this monopoly, acting as Japan's sole window to the Western world. Back in Southeast Asia, the VOC's grip tightened. They orchestrated complex deals with local kings, demanding exclusive rights to certain goods in exchange for Dutch military support or trade access. In some cases, these deals were fair. In others, they were traps, binding rulers into dependency or debt, eventually costing them autonomy. The Dutch rarely sought total control of a region. That was expensive. Instead, they focused on nodes, key points in the network. Like controlling major harbors, straits, and rivers, or acquiring fortified islands that could dominate surrounding waters. They preferred levers over land. Influence over institutions. This maritime mindset meant that the VOC's empire was unusually light-footed. If a colony became too troublesome or unprofitable, it could be abandoned. If a port city changed rulers, the Dutch adapted. Their presence was economic before it was cultural, contractual before it was colonial. The Dutch weren't everywhere, but they made sure to be exactly where it mattered most. And they governed with remarkable discipline. VOC employees were under strict codes: no private trade, no freelancing, no rogue ventures. Corruption still happened, of course, but the company's structure was built for longevity. Every major outpost had layers of oversight. Every major decision traced back to the directors in Amsterdam. If a captain lost cargo, he answered for it. If a governor overstepped, he could be recalled. The system wasn't always fair, but it was ruthlessly efficient. But efficiency had a price. To protect its sprawling interests, the VOC maintained thousands of soldiers across dozens of forts and settlements. They hired mercenaries from Europe and trained native auxiliaries. They enforced harsh discipline on their own crews. Mutiny was rare, and punished swiftly. And when rival powers, especially the British, challenged Dutch dominance, the VOC didn't hesitate to fight. Sea battles flared across the Indian Ocean. Trading posts were captured, retaken, bombarded. Yet for all their militarism, the Dutch preferred to win with negotiation. They offered better terms, better goods, and smoother business. And when that wasn't enough, they simply bought their way to power, bribing officials, subsidizing allies, and making themselves indispensable middlemen. By the mid-1600s, the VOC had created something extraordinary: a decentralized, global network of commerce that spanned 3 continents, operated with clockwork precision, and outperformed every other empire of its time in sheer profitability. It wasn't just the spices or the silver that made them rich, it was the model itself. A network of floating cities. A realm of ledgers and lading bills. A map where the sea was more important than the land. This was not a kingdom. It was a web, and the Dutch were its spiders. While VOC ships stitched together the world's oceans, something equally revolutionary was happening back home in Amsterdam. Trade was only one half of the Dutch success story. The other half was finance, and the Dutch, in the 1600s, were quietly inventing the modern economic system. It began with money, too much of it, in fact. The VOC, flush with profits from its Asian ventures, needed a way to raise more capital, more consistently, without going back to the same investors over and over again. The solution? A new kind of public financing. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602 alongside the VOC itself, was the world's first formal securities market. Here, for the first time, people could buy and sell shares of a company, not just wealthy merchants or noble families, but anyone with enough spare guilders to gamble on the future. Shares in the VOC weren't like today's paper-thin stocks. They were real assets, complete with dividend payouts and the right to attend shareholder meetings. This wasn't just investing. It was a new way to think about risk and reward. You didn't have to own a ship to profit from its voyage. You didn't even have to leave the city. The trading floor became a theater of speculation, with prices rising and falling on rumors of pirate attacks, monsoon delays, or the arrival of a fleet laden with cloves and nutmeg. Amsterdam soon pulsed with financial energy. Banks, modern ones, emerged to handle this river of money. The most famous was the Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609. It offered secure storage, stable currency exchanges, and accounts that merchants across Europe trusted more than the coins in their own pockets. With a reputation for fairness and solidity, it became the backbone of the city's growing economy. Alongside banks came new tools: futures contracts, options, insurance policies. Dutch merchants weren't just trading goods. They were trading the risk of goods, the promise of delivery, the possibility of loss. This financial wizardry allowed the VOC and other companies to hedge their bets, smooth out earnings, and plan long-term. And it wasn't just businesspeople who benefited. Ordinary Amsterdammers could invest their savings, receive dividends, and, if they were lucky, climb the social ladder. A new kind of wealth was forming, one not based on land or titles, but on ledgers, paper, and trust. All of this flowed into a broader cultural confidence. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't just about spice profits, it was about innovation, tolerance, and the rise of a new middle class. Art, science, and urban life flourished. Rembrandt painted burghers in shadow and gold. Vermeer captured the quiet elegance of domestic life. Baruch Spinoza philosophized about reason and freedom, while lenses crafted in Dutch workshops revolutionized astronomy and biology. And at the center of it all? Amsterdam. A city of gables and canals, teeming with languages and faces from across the globe. Persian rugs hung in Dutch living rooms. Chinese porcelain adorned wooden mantels. Japanese lacquerware rested beside tulips, a flower so coveted it sparked its own financial mania, tulip mania, when bulbs traded for the price of townhouses. This cosmopolitanism wasn't accidental. The VOC brought the world to the Netherlands. Ships arrived daily, filled not just with goods, but with ideas and people. Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition found refuge in the Dutch Republic. Protestant exiles from France and Belgium built new lives. Even African and Asian servants became part of Dutch households, sometimes enslaved, sometimes freed, always a reminder that this tiny republic had become a global crossroads. But this wealth, dazzling as it was, had its darker sides. The plantations that fed Dutch sugar dreams in the Caribbean and South America were worked by enslaved Africans, trafficked through VOC and West India Company networks. The sugar poured into Dutch ports in golden bricks, but it came soaked in blood and suffering. The stock exchange may have hummed with progress, but it also masked an empire dependent on hierarchy, exploitation, and human cost. Still, for most citizens of the Republic, the benefits seemed undeniable. Streets were clean. Wages were high. Beer flowed, bread was abundant, and civil unrest was rare. Dutch cities boasted printing presses, schools, and tolerance laws that made them magnets for thinkers and traders alike. By the 1650s, Amsterdam wasn't just a city. It was the commercial capital of the world. A place where fortunes were made in silence over contracts. Where maps were drawn not just to navigate oceans, but to navigate opportunity. Where a man could walk the exchange, strike a deal, and become rich without ever stepping aboard a ship. The Dutch had created something astonishing, a self-sustaining loop of exploration, trade, and finance. The ships brought goods. The goods brought profits. The profits built institutions. And those institutions made it possible to send out even more ships. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it worked. Quietly, elegantly, the Dutch Republic had reshaped the world, and invented the blueprint for the future. Beyond the marble floors of Amsterdam's banks and the silent wealth of stock certificates, the real muscle of the Dutch trading empire lay in the raw goods that fed Europe's insatiable appetite for flavor, luxury, and novelty. And those goods didn't just appear in ports. They were cultivated, processed, and shipped through systems as ruthless as they were profitable. Spices were the golden bait of the East, but the Dutch hunger for profit didn't stop at cloves and nutmeg. Once the VOC had a firm grip on Southeast Asia, it began diversifying its economic base, and that meant plantations. In Ceylon, Java, and the Banda Islands, the Dutch imposed new systems of land use and labor that prioritized monoculture production, growing what Europe wanted, not what local people needed. In the Banda Islands, which had once resisted VOC control so fiercely, the Dutch enforced exclusive nutmeg cultivation. Trees not authorized by the company were destroyed. Locals were forcibly relocated or worse, replaced with enslaved labor from other islands or regions under Dutch sway. Dutch governors parceled out land to settlers and company men, transforming paradise into factory. Elsewhere in the archipelago, the Dutch introduced sugar, coffee, and indigo, crops that could be cultivated at scale and sold at premium prices in Europe. Plantations sprang up along fertile coasts and river valleys, worked by enslaved peoples and indentured laborers, many of whom were imported from other Asian regions. The VOC may have cloaked its operations in the language of trade, but on the ground, it operated like a colonial overlord. And it wasn't just in the East Indies. Across the globe, Dutch ambitions expanded. The Dutch West India Company, WIC, a younger sibling to the VOC, extended the empire into the Atlantic. It targeted the Caribbean, West Africa, and northeastern Brazil, focusing on the booming sugar trade. Unlike the VOC, which played a long game of diplomacy and infrastructure, the WIC acted more like a pirate syndicate. It captured territory by force, including the dramatic seizure of the Brazilian port of Recife, and established slave plantations to pump sugar into Europe. Slave ships soon followed. The Dutch became key players in the transatlantic slave trade, moving tens of thousands of African men, women, and children across oceans to labor in brutal conditions. The profits were staggering. So were the human costs. In Suriname and Curaçao, Dutch planters lived like kings while enslaved workers toiled under blistering heat. Sugar flowed like gold back to Amsterdam. The same ships that returned loaded with cane also brought exotic birds, tropical hardwoods, and new culinary sensations. Dutch tables filled with pineapple, cocoa, and tobacco, and coffee houses sprouted in cities across the Republic, each cup brewed from beans picked by hands in far-off fields. Even their smaller colonies, like the spice-rich Cape Colony in South Africa or the short-lived New Netherland in North America, played a part. The Cape became an agricultural hub, producing wine, grain, and livestock to supply passing VOC fleets. New Amsterdam, what we now call New York City, was a modest Dutch outpost but showcased the same priorities: control the harbor, establish trade, keep settlers in check, and profit. The Dutch colonial system was fundamentally commercial. It didn't seek to convert or civilize, so much as extract and manage. There were no grand imperial narratives, no civilizing missions, only ledgers, output reports, and quotas. The indigenous people in VOC-controlled lands were rarely seen as partners, and the enslaved were barely seen as human. They were inputs, variables in the machinery of trade. Still, Dutch society at home was largely insulated from this brutality. The average citizen knew little of the suffering behind their nutmeg or sugar. They tasted only luxury: warm spices in winter stews, sweet syrups on pancakes, fine fabrics in market stalls. For many, the empire was invisible but ever-present, a soft rustle of silks and a lingering aroma of cinnamon. But not everyone turned a blind eye. As early as the 1650s, Dutch critics began questioning the moral costs of empire. Some preachers condemned slavery from their pulpits. Philosophers whispered about the ethics of profit. Even a few investors began to wonder if endless expansion was sustainable. But these voices remained faint, easily drowned out by dividends. Meanwhile, the VOC continued to expand its reach into industries beyond trade. It built shipyards and textile mills. It minted coins. It funded mapping expeditions and scientific research. It even dabbled in espionage, using its global presence to gather intelligence on rivals and political shifts in Asia. Every venture had one goal: sustain the flow of wealth back to the Netherlands. The company's directors watched from Amsterdam, increasingly disconnected from the realities on the ground but obsessed with maintaining the delicate balance between cost and control. Fortify a port here, pull troops from there. Increase sugar quotas in Suriname. Cut costs in Ceylon. It was empire as algorithm, with spreadsheets instead of swords. But even as profits continued to flow, the weight of the system was beginning to show. The colonies were costly to maintain. Revolts simmered. Competitors circled. The golden age of domination would not last forever. Still, for a few brief decades, the Dutch had turned islands into assets, people into profit, and trade into empire. And the world would never be the same. By the final decades of the 1600s, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. The Dutch trading empire, while still formidable, was beginning to bend under its own weight. The golden glow of prosperity still lit the canals of Amsterdam, but cracks had begun to form in the web the Dutch had so carefully spun across the globe. It wasn't a single blow that brought trouble. It was erosion, slow, relentless, and unavoidable. Rivals had studied the Dutch model and learned its lessons well. The English, in particular, were no longer just a threat at sea, they had become strategic, relentless competitors. The British East India Company, once smaller and less organized than the VOC, now had royal backing, deeper coffers, and a growing empire of its own. The French, too, under the Sun King Louis XIV, were expanding into Asia and Africa, eager to carve out their own piece of the global pie. Wars didn't help. The Anglo-Dutch Wars of the mid to late 1600s drained the Republic's resources and disrupted trade. Ships were lost, colonies attacked, alliances tested. The Dutch still punched above their weight, but the costs of constant defense were rising, and the returns, while still healthy, were shrinking in comparison to the escalating expenses of maintaining the far-flung empire. Internally, the VOC had grown bloated. What began as a lean, aggressive trading firm had become a sprawling bureaucracy weighed down by politics, infighting, and inefficiency. The directors, the famous Gentlemen 17, struggled to control the vast machine they had created. Corruption, once a whisper, now became a rumble. Governors enriched themselves. Bookkeepers manipulated records. Risk-averse officials preferred routine over innovation. Worse still, the very markets the Dutch once dominated were evolving. The spice trade, which had fueled their meteoric rise, was no longer the goldmine it had been. Other European powers had broken the VOC's monopolies. Prices stabilized. Scarcity, once carefully engineered, gave way to competition and oversupply. The Dutch had counted on controlling a trickle of precious goods. But when pepper, cloves, and nutmeg became common in European kitchens, their mystique, and their margins, dissolved. In the Americas and the Caribbean, the sugar colonies remained profitable but volatile. Slave revolts became more frequent. Disease outbreaks ravaged both the enslaved and the settlers. The costs of military presence, medical care, and administrative control piled up. Suriname and Curaçao still sent ships brimming with sweetness back to the Netherlands, but every year, the profits felt a little thinner, the risk a little greater. The Cape Colony, meant as a simple resupply station, began to morph into something more complicated. Dutch settlers pushed inland, clashing with indigenous Khoikhoi peoples. A new settler society, known as the Boers, emerged, independent, tough, and increasingly difficult for the VOC to manage. What had once been a tool in a larger network threatened to become a problem in its own right. Even Japan, where the Dutch had once enjoyed exclusive access, began to grow wary. The Tokugawa shogunate tightened restrictions. Trade continued, but under even stricter scrutiny. The window to the east narrowed. And yet, for all this, what the Dutch created did not simply vanish. The VOC lasted until 1799, nearly 2 centuries of operation, before being formally dissolved and absorbed into the Dutch state. But its legacy was far longer. It had reshaped the rules of global commerce, introduced modern financial systems, and proven that empires didn't need crowns and colonies to wield power. They could be built on contracts, on credit, on quiet negotiations conducted thousands of miles from any battlefield. More than that, it had changed the map. Entire port cities, Jakarta, Cape Town, New York, bear the fingerprints of Dutch design, Dutch priorities, Dutch ambition. The waterways and warehouse districts of Amsterdam inspired urban planners for centuries. The idea that a company could govern, tax, and command armies? That didn't die with the VOC, it became a blueprint. But there were also lessons in hubris. In pushing efficiency, the Dutch sometimes forgot humanity. In chasing monopoly, they alienated allies. In expanding their reach, they stretched themselves too thin. Their story became a cautionary tale that even the smartest system, even the richest network, can unravel if it forgets the people inside it. Today, we remember the Dutch not as conquerors draped in banners, but as merchants with maps. Their empire was quiet, calculated, and deeply modern. It whispered instead of shouted. It traded instead of crusade. But in its own way, it was just as transformative. The world after the Dutch was more connected, more commercial, more complex. Goods moved faster, ideas traveled further, and capital flowed like never before. The VOC didn't just shape the 1600s, it helped invent the global age. So, the next time you sip your coffee, sprinkle cinnamon on your toast, or trade a stock with a click, remember that it all began with a tiny republic, a handful of ships, and a dream big enough to circle the world.